Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's my honor and privilege to introduce you to Jonathan Rapping, who is the founder and executive director of Gideon's Promise, which is an innovative, really transformative nonprofit organization that is dedicated to the principle of training and mentoring a new generation of public defenders and sending them out to the most under-resourced and under-built up offices in the country. They have literally been part of building offices from the ground up, creating some of the first public defender offices in under-resourced states such as Alabama. We're really proud at UCLA to have been part of the founding and growing of that program. We were the first law school to establish a law school partnership program together with Gideon's Promise, where we have sent a number of students each year to become part of this growing movement, beginning with Ariana, who joined the first public defender's office in Birmingham and is still there practicing, and now I just learned mentoring other new lawyers coming in and becoming part of this intensive training and mentoring program. So we're thrilled to have him here today to talk about Gideon's Promise, but also his new book, which documents that movement, Gideon's Promise, a public defender movement to transform criminal justice. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
So I hope some of you will consider joining us. As Professor Eagley said, Ariana and Travis were both on the ground floor of starting offices in Birmingham and Montgomery. They are superstars. If you have any nervousness about leaving LA, as I know law students across the country are nervous about going to places unknown, call them, because both of them went to places they didn't know and have thrived. And they've really been on the front lines of what I think is a critical movement to transform criminal justice, which I also think is a leading civil rights issue of our time. So I hope some of you will choose to join us. I want to start the talk by showing you a video.
Okay. Daddy is the sweetest daddy in the world. Daddy is the most handsome, the smartest, the most clever, the kindest. He is my Superman. Daddy wants me to do well at school. Daddy is just great, but he lies. He lies about having a job. He lies about having money. He lies that he is not tired. He lies that he is not hungry. He lies that we have everything. He lies about his happiness. He lies because of me.
I tear up a little bit every time I see that. I've probably seen that 100 times. I tear up a bit because I have a daughter who thinks her father walks on water, who I would do anything in the world for. If I found myself unable to put food on the table and faced with the choice of maybe breaking one of society's rules or letting her go hungry, there's no question in my mind which one I would choose. But I also tear up a bit because I know that man. I've represented him in countless cases. America's prisons and jails are filled with people like him, people who are parents, who work hard, who try to get ahead, but ultimately can't make ends meet and maybe do something desperate. And in criminal justice systems across the country, if a person like that is ultimately caught stealing a sandwich to feed his hungry daughter, he will be arrested, thrown into the criminal justice system, and given a label. Right, that label will be thief. And without a public defender there to offer a counter narrative, a narrative of a father, a narrative of a caring person, a narrative of a hard worker, he will go through the system labeled a thief and be processed into a prison cell. We'll never know what happened to his daughter. Perhaps she will drop out of school, end up in the foster care system or the juvenile justice system. Without a public defender to challenge that narrative, that will be a life thrown away. I actually think that as a nation, we were awakened 5 years ago to a cruel reality that equal justice is a myth. With the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, it's not that what happened to Michael Brown was new in America, but there was social media and the story went viral, and as a nation we jerked awake. And it seemed like after the Michael Brown killing, there were almost this endless stream of killings where people, predominantly black men, were killed in police encounters. Men like Eric Garner in New York City, 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio, Walter Scott in North Charleston, South Carolina, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Samuel DuBose in Cincinnati, Sandra Bland in Texas, and the names just kept coming. Philando Castile outside of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Terrence Kutcher, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Keith Lamont Scott, Charlotte, North Carolina. We can literally spend the remainder of our time just naming these names. I want to stop at Keith Lamont Scott because I remember when Keith Lamont Scott was killed, and I remember the protests in Charlotte that followed. And as I watched the televised accounts, I saw a courageous little girl, a 9-year-old girl, Ziana Oliphant. She testified before the Charlotte City Council. And this is what she said.
I come here today to talk about how I feel. And I feel like that we are treated differently than other people. And I don't like how we're treated. And just because of our color doesn't mean anything to me. I believe that
You're doing great. You're doing a great job.
Don't stop. Do not stop.
we are black people and we shouldn't have to feel like this. We shouldn't have to protest because y'all are treating us wrong. We do this because we need to and have rights.
Go ahead. Let her talk. Go ahead.
I've been born and raised in Charlotte, and I've never felt this way till now. And I can't stand how we're treated. And it's a shame that our fathers and mothers are killed, and we can't even see them anymore.
That's right.
It's a shame that we have to go to that graveyard and buried them. And we have tears, and we shouldn't have tears. We need our fathers and mothers to be by our side.
So that 9-year-old girl, it's heartbreaking to hear her testify before city council. And it's maybe tempting to think, because that testimony comes days after the killing of Keith Lamont Scott, that really what she's talking about is solely about police killings of men like Keith Lamont Scott. But when you really think about it, you know that that 9-year-old girl didn't just come to that realization a couple days earlier when Keith Lamont Scott was killed. What you realize is that children like her all across the country are exposed to mass incarceration when the people they care about are police, are rounded up, are prosecuted, are over-incarcerated. Right? For every person shot and killed by a police officer, tens of thousands are thrown into America's criminal justice system and processed into cages. It's that routine injustice that is crippling our most marginalized communities and sending messages to children who live there about the value of their own lives. I actually learned this primarily through my wife, who is the co-founder of Gideon's Promise. Her name is Illy. Illy's not a lawyer. Illy was exposed to the criminal justice system in a different way from me. When she was 5 years old, her father went to prison. He had been arrested and charged with crimes he committed years earlier. By the time he was arrested, he turned his life around. He was a small business owner. He got married, converted to Islam, had 4 children. Illy at 5 was the oldest. Her father was her world. And then he was arrested and given a public defender, and that public defender never told his story. Without someone to advocate for him, he was sentenced to 10 years in Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York. And Illy grew up knowing her father from behind bars. And what she said to me that always stuck with me was, you know, what was even harder than growing up with a father behind bars was coming to realize that the people you care about don't matter. She watched every man in her life have contact with the criminal justice system. And really the primary person who delivered that message to Illy and her family and her father was a public defender. That was the person who had the direct contact with the family. And because they didn't care, maybe they were overwhelmed, maybe they were beaten down, but because they didn't show they cared, she got the message that she didn't matter. Public defenders are the vehicle through which so many marginalized people understand the criminal justice system. And time after time, public defenders are failing in that regard. It's, again, not because they're bad people, but because oftentimes they're overwhelmed, they're undertrained, they're under-resourced. They don't have support. If we don't change that, we can't change the way impacted communities hear that message. And so I believe public defenders are narrative changers. I believe we're narrative rewriters, and I believe that we have to rewrite a narrative that desperately needs to be rewritten. It's as old as the nation itself. If you go back in time, go back 100 years, and you think of what justice looked like for marginalized communities, predominantly African American communities all across the country, and you know there wasn't justice, right? There was an accusation levied, there was a lynch mob, they found the nearest tree, and there was an execution. For decades following Reconstruction, there wasn't even a pretense of due process. And I believe that over time as a nation, we started to realize that we are hypocritical. We started to realize that we talk about being this beacon of justice, but look what's happening in our own backyard. And there started to be pressure on Southern justice systems And in turn, the justice systems put pressure on the lynch mobs, and they said, look, if you would just quit these lynchings that are making us look bad and bring them directly to us, we will very quickly try them, convict them, and execute them. And we entered an era really of legalized lynchings, perhaps best epitomized by the story of the Scottsboro boys, 9 children who were pulled off a train in Scottsboro, Alabama, accused of raping 2 white women. They were given 2 lawyers. One was a lawyer from Tennessee who came down at the urging of a family member of one of these young men. Didn't know any Alabama law or procedure, and he was immediately drafted. The second was an Alabama lawyer, hadn't practiced in over 30 years, didn't really remember Alabama law, was a notorious drunk. He was appointed. The 2 of them didn't do any investigation. They didn't file any motions. They didn't prepare their clients. That afternoon, trial started within days. 8 of the 9 young men were sentenced to die. Only the 12-year-old given life without parole. And the case became a cause célèbre, literally across the country, in fact, across the world. People said, America, you are hypocritical. And I believe that was the start of an era where we started to realize that we had to start living up to our ideals. I think it's the start of an era where we started to see demand for advocates to fight for people who didn't have anyone to speak for them. And so we started to see TV shows like The Public Defender, right, that put at the center public defenders. People would gather around their TV sets if they had them to watch a TV show about public defenders. 1956, there was literally a comic book called The Public Defender. Look at that. This guy's getting shot at. His pipe is flying out of his mouth, hat flying off his head. He's dodging bullets. People are running to the newsstand. Children, they don't care about Batman or Wonder Woman. They want to be the public defender. And we're heroes. 3 years later, Jimmy Stewart plays a defense lawyer in Anatomy of a Murder. A defense lawyer who represents a man accused of murder, and we love him. And then in 1962, Atticus Finch takes to the silver screen as, Gregory Peck takes to the silver screen as Atticus Finch, a fictional lawyer in a fictional town in Alabama who is representing a black man accused of raping a white woman, and the nation loves him. He engenders all of the values that have been ignored. Now, it's true, at this era, we didn't have a racial perspective, right? We still had to talk about these values through the lens of our biggest, whitest stars, but it was telling us something about this evolution of starting to grapple with the fact that we were ignoring basic rights. And I don't think it's a coincidence that a year later, the Supreme Court decided the case of Clarence Earl Gideon versus Wayne. Because it was a time when we were starting to come to terms with the fact that people cannot get justice in the courts if they don't have a lawyer. And I don't believe we can understand Gideon without understanding that struggle to realize basic civil and human rights. And the era continued. Perry Mason was the longest running show about a defense lawyer at this time. Not only did we love the defense lawyers, think about how we viewed the outlaws. When I was a kid, all of my favorite movies were about outlaws. Paul Newman went to prison for cutting the tops off of parking meters. Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway as Bonnie and Clyde, bank robbers. Paul Newman and Robert Redford as train robbers. Al Pacino as a bank robber in Dog Day Afternoon, a terribly flawed but deeply humane bank robber, and we loved him and rooted for him against the nameless, faceless state. And then things changed. We entered a tough on crime era because that commitment to civil and human rights didn't last very long. We saw a tough on crime era, war on drugs, and before you know it, politicians were running with tough on crime messaging, using images of people like Willie Horton to get elected. You all know Willie Horton? Willie Horton was the man who was furloughed in Massachusetts, didn't come back, committed some terrible crimes, And the first George Bush, George H.W. Bush, used Willie Horton to sink the campaign of Michael Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts at the time. The media started to jump on the tough on crime bandwagon. The Central Park Five, we now know them as the Exonerated Five. Children who were charged with a terrible beating and rape in Central Park in 1989. Before they even went to trial, the media immediately branded them as a wolf pack. They coined the phrase wildly, not even trying to hide this attempt at dehumanizing these young men who we now know were innocent, but they didn't stand a chance in that tough on crime era. And it wasn't a partisan approach. Bill Clinton, who at the time was the darling of the Democratic Party, he was running for the nomination in the Democratic primary in 1991, and he had a problem. He was the governor of Arkansas, and there was a man named Ricky Ray Rector on death row. Ricky Ray Rector had shot and killed somebody, agreed to turn himself in, and when the police came to arrest him, he killed the police officer before putting the gun to his head and trying to take his own life. But he didn't take his own life. Instead, he blew away a chunk of his brain, literally rendering him a completely different person, an incredibly limited individual. He was convicted and sentenced to die, and his execution date was during the Democratic primary campaign. And Bill Clinton had a decision to make. Do I fly home and watch that execution, or do I commute the sentence of a man who I know isn't competent? And there was a New Yorker article where people who knew Bill Clinton talked about how he struggled with this decision because he knew it wasn't right to execute a man in Ricky Ray Rector's situation, but he also wanted to be president. And he knew what happened with Willie Horton. He wasn't willing to give up his political career, so he flew home and presided over the execution of Ricky Ray Rector. The night before Ricky Ray Rector was executed, he had his last meal. Included in it was a piece of pecan pie. He asked the guards to put the pie away for later because he was so limited, he didn't know there wouldn't be a later. But Bill Clinton understood that in this tough on crime era, you could not afford to commute the sentence of a man like Ricky Ray Rector. By now we all know Hillary Clinton, and let me be clear, I am not picking on Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton represents what every politician in that era were doing. Hillary Clinton, as the First Lady, had this to say.
But we also have to have an organized effort against gangs. Just as in a previous generation we had an organized effort against the mob. We need to take these people on. They are often connected to big drug cartels. They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel, and the president is...
These are the kinds of kids called super predators, no conscience, no empathy. We can talk about how they ended up this way, but first we have to bring them to heel. Who do you bring to heel? It's not even veiled. The dehumanizing language, it wasn't Republican, it wasn't Democratic. Unfortunately, that was America. That is America. That's the America you all are stepping into as lawyers. The longest running crime drama series of all time, Law and Order. Who watches Law and Order? So my daughter, my daughter knows she wants to be a public defender. She's known it since she was born. She like sneaks into her room and watches Law and Order, right, and won't tell me. But every once in a while she'll run downstairs to tell me how messed up it was, because they're not very nice to the lawyers or the people who are accused. But it's entertaining, so she too watches it. But the beginning, right, the beginning of Law and Order goes like this.
In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the police who investigate crime and the district attorneys who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories.
What the? Look, in the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups. The police who investigate crime and the district attorneys who prosecute the offenders. Where are we? Where are the public defenders? Literally, they are irrelevant to today's criminal justice narrative. They're not even a speed bump between arrest and conviction. I was at on the campus of Ohio State giving a similar talk, and there were public defenders in the audience. And after the talk, one of them sent me an email. And they said, Rap, everybody calls me Rap. Y'all should call me Rap. They said, the email said, Rap, I gotta share this picture with you from our courthouse. And their offices in the courthouse. You shared this picture with me of a directory in the courthouse. Directory, basement, public restrooms, public defenders. Right? Not only are we in the basement, we're below the public restrooms. And I always say to our lawyers when I talk about that is, don't take it personally. We'll take it personally in the sense that this work is personal. But it's not because they hate you. It's because they hate the people you serve. It's because they hate the people you serve. Because we live in a society where the narrative has portrayed every person in the criminal justice system as young, violent super predators like those portrayed in movies like Juice and Menace to Society. And we've all embraced that narrative. And it leads to people who literally fuel injustice. I was on Twitter not long ago and I saw this post from a prosecutor. They received the winner. Wherefore on this date let it be known that this prosecutor hereby got their pound of flesh. Guilty is guilty. Winning. And the prosecutor writes, got this beauty today for a Christmas gift from one of my favorite co-workers, clearly not recognizing just how perverse that is. That there is an office that is literally saying, we see the people that you prosecute as hunks of meat. What could be less human than that? And prosecutors proudly boast about that. And let me again, I'm going to say this a few times. I do not mean to pick on prosecutors or politicians or public defenders who have gone along with the system. What I've come to understand is that culture is powerful and culture will shape you into someone you had never expected to become if you don't have a way to stay conscious, have a community that supports you, lifts you up, and reminds you of why you came to do this work in the first place. It's culture. And so this image, this is one of the most powerful images. I don't know the last time I've done a presentation where I haven't shared this image. My kids, for Father's Day, got me a screen print of this image. It actually hangs in my office above my desk. And the caption is simply Indifference by an artist named Frank Wu. It's these robotic legs walking past a homeless veteran curled up in a fetal position. And the message is really straightforward, right? That all of us every day are bombarded by so much misery, so much grief. It's just human nature after a while to become desensitized, to build a wall. Not because we're bad people, but because we're human beings. I think about this all the time with my children. My children remind me of this because my kids, they grew up as these homeless advocates. We lived down the street from what was the largest homeless shelter in Atlanta, at the corner of Peachtree and Pine. It's been shut down and replaced with nothing. But when it was up, my children would bring toiletries and sandwiches down to the homeless shelter. My son, who's now 11, when he was about 6 or 7, he said to me once, he said, Daddy, if you could be anyone in the world when you grow up, I'm 53 years old, he said, if you could be anyone in the world when you grow up, who would you be? I said, wow, Lucas, that's an interesting question. I don't know. Who would you be? He said, I'd either be Troy Polamalu, his favorite football player, or a homeless person. I said, a homeless person? Lucas, why would you be a homeless person? He said, because then I could grow up. I know what it feels like. I could grow up and do something about it. My daughter, when she was about the same age, she would break open her piggy bank and put the change in a baggie to give to the homeless man we would pass on the way to school. One day I was walking down the street with my daughter and a man said, sir, can you spare $1? And I said, I'm sorry, sir, I can't help it. I kept walking, I felt this tug on my sleeve. I looked down, it was my daughter. And she said, Daddy, I said, yeah, baby. She said, Daddy, doesn't that man need $1 more than you? I thought to myself, of course he does. And then I thought to myself, where did she learn that from? Right? She learned it from me, she learned it from her mother. But it was a reminder that all of us, if we don't guard against indifference, we can lose sight of the values we hold dearest, the values we teach our own children. I would say this lesson is more relevant to lawyers than anyone else I've ever met. Because you can walk into courtrooms across this country and you will see judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers who are watching human beings processed into cages, human beings being treated every day in ways we would never tolerate for our own children, and there is no outrage. And when you get to know those people, you know they're good people. You know they came into this work for the right reasons. You know they've been shaped by a system that has taught them that the only way to survive is to become indifferent. I'm going to show you a video of a social experiment in New York City.
Brother, you alright, little brother? What's the matter? You homeless?
Yeah.
You homeless? Yeah, you cold, bro? Tell me what happened to you. What happened to you? Where's your parents?
They abandoned me when I
Your
was
parents
7.
abandoned you when you were 7 years old? And you out here all by yourself? Yeah.
Cold.
What? Yeah, you cold, bro?
So
Let me give you
cold.
my jacket. Let me give you my
Oh my
I'm
God.
gonna make you feel warm, alright? Let me make you feel warm. You good? You hungry?
I'm so hungry.
still give something to people. You know? I mean, what? Yeah, love you, brother.
So much.
Huh?
Thank you.
I know.
So
I mean, so you take vengeance at a young age. Your family. No family. See, I can communicate because I'm homeless. I'm homeless. And me being an older homeless person, we gotta look out for one another.
So let me stop it there and just think about that. Over 2 hours, hundreds of people walked past this child on the street. One person stopped. What made that one person different? Why do you think that one person stopped? You all know he got into UCLA and just was shot. He's homeless. So we can empathize. Empathy. I think the thing most important to teach lawyers who are going to go into the criminal justice system is empathy. It is easy to lose empathy. I teach law school in Atlanta. I do orientation, and I talk to our first-year law students every year, and I always ask them, why are you here? And they raise their hands, and one after the other, they have these idealistic answers, right? I want to help this cause or help this community. And I share with them a quote by an unnamed law student that says, the first thing I lost in law school is the reason why I came. Right? You all get that. And I tell them, you're about to enter a first-year curriculum where we are going to teach you that the law can be reduced to rules and doctrine, to black letters on a white page. At the end of your first year, I would challenge you to tell me one story of one person behind the many cases you've read. None of them can do it. We're going to teach you the value of thinking like a lawyer, which means it's intellectual. But we devalue feeling. And let me be clear, I am not saying learning to think like a lawyer, learning to analyze, learning IRAC or PREAC isn't critically important, but if divorced from empathy, the best you can do is perpetuate the status quo, which isn't working for people on the outside. So I think we need a generation of lawyers who bring empathy to this work, who remind people in this work that the folks who are impacted are human beings. And that's why you all are so critical, because my generation has failed. Right? We need another generation to do that. Amy Bach is a lawyer and a journalist. She went around the country studying criminal justice systems. And she determined the one thing that every system has in common is that injustice has become normalized. It's become ordinary, that ordinary justice defines criminal justice in America. She has a chapter in this book on public defenders, chapter on prosecutors, chapter on judges. She starts the book by saying ordinary injustice occurs when a community of legal professionals become so used to lapses in the system, they lose sight of their own role in perpetuating it. The cost of that ordinary injustice is stunning. You know these numbers. We have 5% of the world's population, 25% of its prison population. We have at any given time 2.3 million people housed in cages, 6 by 10 feet, dirty, dangerous. We couldn't do that to people if we saw them as human beings. In the state next door, Arizona, Sheriff Joe Arpaio was popularly elected 6 times on a tough on crime platform. He built tent cities in sweltering 120-degree desert heat to house pretrial detainees. These are people who are presumed innocent. He forced them to wear pink underwear because in his warped mind, that somehow would strip them of every last shred of dignity that they had, and yet he was elected 6 times. We couldn't do that if we saw these people as human beings. Right here in California. In 2012, residents of penal institutions across the state went on hunger strikes, right? Literally saying, I would rather be dead than housed in these conditions. Some didn't eat for up to 60 days. We couldn't do that to people if we saw them as human beings. By now, everyone knows the story of Khalif Browder, 15 years old, accused of stealing a backpack in New York City, sent to Rikers Island, one of the most notoriously violent and dangerous jails in the country. He was housed there for 3 years, 2.5 of them in solitary confinement. He endured beatings not only by other residents of Rikers, but by jail guards. After 3 years, the state had to admit they didn't have the evidence to prosecute him, and they threw the case out. But it was too late. The damage was done. Within 2 years, his mother found him hung in her own home. And you think about a community of legal professionals who for 3 years watched that happen and said nothing. We couldn't do that if we saw Khalif Browder as a human being. And so I think back to Gideon and the role of public defenders. And I think about the fact that it was 1963, the same year as the March on Washington, the same year as so many civil rights milestones. And it really makes me think differently about Gideon. Because when I studied Gideon, I saw it as being about lawyers who stand up for one person at a time, one case at a time, to make sure they get justice in one courtroom at a time. But now I really do understand it differently. Gideon was decided in 1963 at a time when we were grappling with the fact that we were failing to provide basic human and civil rights to our most marginalized populations in every walk of life, in housing, in education, in transportation, and not least among them in criminal justice. Gideon is part of a civil rights revolution along with Brown versus Board of Education, a whole menu of civil rights legislation. Gideon versus Wainwright is a civil rights case, and it birthed public defenders as civil rights lawyers. This image, this iconic image from 1968, Memphis sanitation workers, striking with a sign, a basic sign that says, "I am a man," right? Just a simple message, see me as a human being, and we see that as history. But today we have people taking to the streets with banners that say Black Lives Matter. Aren't they really saying the same thing? Just see me as a human being. There's a proverb, an African proverb that says, "Until the lion learns to write, the story will always glorify the hunter." We have populations of people who have been silenced. Their stories have never been told. Their humanity has never been seen. Public defenders represent 80% of the people in the criminal justice system. Collectively, if mobilized to understand their role differently, public defenders have the power to rewrite that narrative, to infuse the systems with those stories and with that humanity. What we do at Gideon's Promise is we are building a movement of public defenders to understand their role as systems change agents. So they don't feel overwhelmed by the fact that they don't feel like they're doing enough one case at a time. Collectively, they're changing the world, but the work is hard. And as I watch TV shows about public defenders, for the most part, public defenders are disrespected, but even the best shows have shown public defenders being sort of noble in work in individual cases. Anyone ever watch How to Get Away with Murder? Ever see that? So I'm a big Viola Davis fan. I watched the first episode of How to Get Away with Murder, and I hate it. I hated it because she was this law teacher who was teaching students to be manipulative, to cut corners, to be unethical. Even the title, How to Get Away with Murder, perpetuates the worst stereotypes about defense lawyers. And although she wasn't a public defender, I saw this as the quintessential anti-public defender TV show. Because what I understood was that if society embraces this stereotype of defense lawyers, the only people who will suffer are those who rely on public dollars to fund their lawyers. So I hated the show. And then I came home one night and my wife was watching, it was like a crossover series with Scandal and How to Get Away with Murder. And Annalise Keaton, the lawyer played by Viola Davis, was arguing a Supreme Court case, a Sixth Amendment case. And it was the first time, and I gotta tell you, my mother was a professor of popular culture. And she would study popular culture. She actually wrote about the role of lawyers in popular culture. And she raised me to understand that everything we watch is messaging values. Sometimes we don't even realize it. But everything we watch has a value message in it. I was listening to an interview of Jesse Jackson Jr. a long time ago, and Jesse Jackson Jr. was asked, "Did your parents raise you to be political?" Jesse Jackson Jr. said, let me tell you something. My parents raised me to understand by virtue of the fact that I am a human being in this world, I'm political. The question is, am I politically conscious or politically unconscious? And my parents raised me to be politically conscious. My mother taught me that popular culture oftentimes shapes us unconsciously. And so I watched TV thinking about that. How are public defenders and the people they serve portrayed? And this was the first episode where I saw anyone talk about public defenders the way I think we need to talk about public defenders, as critical to an ongoing struggle for civil and human rights. So I want to share this clip with you.
As an arbiter of the law with whole knowledge of historical jurisprudence in this country, race must always be considered a variable.
You have precious time, Miss Keating. I suggest that you don't waste it by making arguments you've already made.
These are not my words, Justice Strickland. They're yours. You wrote them in your 1985 ruling in Bryant v. Topeka, an equal protection case dealing with a state housing lottery program. Racism is built into the DNA of America. And as long as we turn a blind eye to the pain of those suffering under its oppression, we will never escape those origins. The only safeguard people of color have is the right to a defense, and we won't even give them that. Which means that the promise of civil rights has never been fulfilled. Due to the failure of our justice system, our public defense system in particular, Jim Crow is alive and kicking. Laws that made it illegal for blacks and whites to be buried in the same cemetery. They categorize people into quadroons and octoroons. They punish a black person for seeking medical attention in a white hospital. Some may claim that slavery has ended. But tell that to the inmates who are kept in cages and told that they don't have any rights at all. People like my client Nathaniel Leahy and millions of people like him who are relegated to a subclass of human existence in our prisons. There is no alternative to justice in this case. There is no other option. To decide against my plaintiff is to choose lining the pockets of prison owners over providing basic defense for the people who live in them. And is that the America that this court really wants to live in? Where money is more important than humanity? Where criminality is confused with mental health? The Sixth Amendment was ratified in 1791. It's been 226 years since then. Let's finally guarantee its rights to all of our citizens.
Yes, Viola Davis. That was nice, wasn't it? So I got to say, I am really, I stand here proud to be at UCLA. Because as Ingrid said, this was the first school to launch our law school partnership project. And through that project, every year, we now partner with 24 law schools across the country to bring law students to partner offices, mostly across the South, but even beyond. And I think about when I was a law student and I knew I wanted to be a public defender. And like, I'm sure so many of you, I went to the same job fairs as every other law student who wanted to be a public defender, interview with the same half dozen offices for the same set of positions. And I ended up going to the DC Public Defender Service. And I stepped into a place where I was able to help maintain a really high standard of practice. And in retrospect, I realized that if I didn't go to PDS, no one in DC would have suffered one bit, because there were a line of law students just as good as me waiting for those jobs. And I now do this work in Georgia and Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana. And I realize that when UCLA and other schools send lawyers like Ariana and Travis to Alabama, they're filling a void that otherwise would be filled by a lawyer that maybe doesn't care, maybe doesn't even like their clients. I just finished. We bring all our lawyers together for 2 weeks, and then we gather every 6 months after that. And we just, last weekend, were together with 300 public defenders who are the most inspiring, amazing lawyers I've ever met. They literally give me hope every 6 months. And I look out at these folks and I think, they are a community in a place where 15 years ago there was no community, there was no ethos of client-centered representation. Their days are hard, but they never have to ask whether they're making a difference. So we start this 3-year experience with a 2-week program. And we go through 2 weeks, and after the 2 weeks, everybody leaves fired up, thinking they're going to change the world. They go back to their offices, and pretty soon the phone starts ringing, and me and the other faculty start getting calls, and they all go something like this. Hey, Rap, I think I'm going to quit. I now understand what every person deserves, every client deserves. I can't give it to them. I've got 300 cases. And I share with them a story that I learned from a book I read called Freedom Summer, which was a book about that summer project in 1964 where young folks went to Mississippi to build freedom schools to help people pass literacy tests, to register people to vote. And the author, Bruce Watson, tells the story through the eyes of people who were there. He interviews them, albeit 40 years later. And you learn through these stories that these folks went to Mississippi thinking they would change the world, and as the summer went on, their hope turned to despair. They started saying things like, maybe my family was right, maybe I can't make a difference. Bruce Watson fast forwards 40 years to a conversation with Congressman John Lewis, who was one of the architects of Freedom Summer. John Lewis said, you know, if it weren't for Freedom Summer, Barack Obama wouldn't be in the White House. Quite literally, he was saying, sometimes change is so incremental, those most involved in it don't even realize that's what they're doing. And I share that with our lawyers when they call. And I say, every time you walk into a courtroom and a judge just wants you to sit down and shut up and go on with the process, and you say, Judge, I'm not doing it today. When you do that, you may not get the tangible result your client deserves, but when you do that, and your colleagues do it in the courtroom next door, and another group are doing it in the next county over, and another group in the next state over, collectively you're raising expectations about what justice means to the world. Collectively, you are changing the world. So I'm thankful to UCLA for helping us jumpstart the Law School Partnership Project, because I believe all these lawyers who have come to help with this movement are changing the world, are creating a world that I want my kids to be proud of. So I'm honored for that. I'm going to actually jump ahead. Actually, I love this picture, this image. Sisyphus. Every public defender can relate to Sisyphus. I think sometimes we relate in a negative way. It's kind of like, man, no matter how much we push, the boulder keeps rolling back. I actually look at this picture differently. I think Sisyphus is a hero. Because if Sisyphus wasn't there, where would that boulder be? It'd be at the bottom of the hill. And if Sisyphus can hold on long enough for a second to join, and then a third, you start getting movement. And so I love this quote by Albert Camus. In an absurd world, the struggle itself, the struggle toward the heights, not victory, is enough to fill a person's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. There is truly happiness in being a part of a struggle when you know that struggle needs to be fought. One of my favorite quotes was shared with me by a public defender colleague. His grandfather told him this quote. It says, every day you write your epitaph. I love that quote. Every day you write your epitaph. If you think about that, how can you afford to waste one day? How can you afford to not write that one additional chapter that will be your legacy? You're going to leave UCLA. You all are going to have the opportunity to do anything you want. You're going to have the opportunity to make as much money as lawyers can make, to live as comfortably as lawyers live, to have as many material things as lawyers have. You can do all that. But think about when you're 60, 70, 80 years old, you're looking back over your life and you're saying, what did I do with my career? Right? think about that. Because there's not a single day I'm not grateful for the fact that I never have to regret what I've done with the 25 years that I was a lawyer. I just really, my hope is, you may not be public defenders, I hope you all can say that 25 years after graduation. So I'm going to jump ahead, and I want to just share with you. Ingrid told you that I wrote a book. It is coming out May 5th. And the reason I wrote it is because, as I said, I'm inspired by all of the public defenders we work with, and I'm absolutely convinced that they are the key to justice reform. And about 5 years ago, the nation started having a conversation about criminal justice reform. And we now hear people talking about things like bail reform, sentencing reform, progressive prosecution, right? We hear these things, but the one piece that is never mentioned is public defenders. And I am absolutely convinced that none of those things can succeed without public defenders. You can have all the bail reform you want. You can have judges who are literally committed to deciding the right pretrial placements. But if there's not an advocate there helping the judge understand the human being standing there and who they are, how's the judge going to make that decision? On the back end, we can do away with mandatory minimums and give judges discretion to really fashion just outcomes, but if they don't know the human being standing there, how can they do it? We talk about progressive prosecutors. I'll admit this is a whole nother session. To me, that's an oxymoron. I don't think there's such a thing as a progressive prosecutor, any more than I think there's such a thing as compassionate genocide, right? I just don't think there's such a thing. But let me also be clear about this. I applaud the progressive prosecutor movement because I think they're less cruel prosecutors. I think they're less punitive prosecutors. I think we need them. I think they're good people. I think they are progressive people who are doing work that can never be progressive. Because as long as you're in a system where the only people who you have to make decisions about are poor, are disproportionately people of color, you can be less cruel, but you can't call those results progressive. So let me be clear, when I say I don't believe in progressive prosecutors, I don't mean these aren't progressive people. Thank goodness for Chesa Boudin. Right? Thank goodness, I wish everyone was that prosecutor. But if Chesa Boudin doesn't have a system of public defenders making sure he knows the human beings, working with him to make sure the judges know the human beings, there is nothing about those outcomes that can be progressive. And so at the end of the day, I believe public defenders are literally have to be centered in every one of those conversations. And so this book really centers public defenders in these conversations. It makes the argument that policy fixes alone, right? Deciding to not charge marijuana, deciding to not ask for bail when it comes to shoplifting, while those are good, they're simply less cruel. If we don't engage in culture change, if we don't engage in a transformation of value, if we don't engage in rewriting the narrative, we can't really have equal justice, and public defenders are indispensable to that effort. So I share that with you. If any of you are interested, I've got cards you can share with family members. The book is basically the themes of this talk. I will also tell you it comes out May 5th, but we have a pre-order campaign, and a portion of all pre-orders will go to the public defenders who we support all across the South. Last thing I'm going to say, and that is this question: when's the last time you felt needed? When's the last time when you felt needed? And I think to myself, public defenders literally don't have to think back more than an hour. And I think we sometimes forget how valuable it is, how important it is to have an answer to that question. And one day I was watching TV and there was a commercial. It was a commercial for feeding hungry children overseas. And it really reminded me of public defenders, with the exception of the kids in the overseas. And so I edited that part out. But the rest, I think, is really relevant because it's a reminder of how many people don't have an answer to this question. And I want to play this snippet for you.
time in my life when what?
Oh, wow, that's a really hard question.
When I was needed.
Probably I haven't felt needed yet. So far, I've been needy.
My sister, she needs me.
I'm actually being needed right this second. Excuse me.
There was this kid in my class named Brady, and I thought about standing up for him. I didn't want to be embarrassed, so I didn't, but I should have. Yeah.
I didn't think, I just went.
When? Where? How? What do we need to do?
It felt very exhilarating to sort of have that feeling of being a hero.
I felt like I was necessary.
So I fell to the ground with her and just laid right next to her. And she'd go, "Why did you do that for?" And I said, "Because someone needs to be on the ground with you so I could help you up."
So I'm going to wrap up and say this. Again, for 25 years, I've never not had an answer to that question. There's no amount of money you can pay me to not have an answer to that question. I pray all of you leave law school and find a job where every day you can answer that question. I'm not naive enough to think that all of you will decide that that means you have to join Gideon's Promise, but I hope maybe 1, 2, 3 of you do, and if there are folks in the room interested in doing that through our law school partnership project, please reach out. And even if that's not something you're interested in, reach out. There's no call I'm more excited to take than future lawyers thinking about where they fit into this critically important profession. Thank you all.